On tonight's episode of Mr. Norris's In Case You Missed It, we look at the Declaration of Independence, what took place at the Second Continental Congress, what all went into the Declaration, and what were its consequences for the new nation. Hey, hi, hello, and what is up, everybody? It's your host, Mr. Norris, the history teacher with the good hair. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence, the most famous breakup letter of all time. It's not you, it's me. No, it's you, Great Britain. I'm sorry, it's you. But yes, we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence and exactly what went into it, what it was all about, what were the consequences. So some great stuff tonight. To start talking about the Declaration of Independence, we really have to talk about the Second Continental Congress, which began and opened up and started taking place on May 10th, 1775. Now, the First Continental Congress had met in 1774 to try to clear up issues between the 13 colonies in Great Britain with little to no success. And at that Congress, they decided the delegates to come up with increased boycotts of British goods. They decided to create militias, just in case things got violent with the British. And they drafted letters to send to King George and the British Parliament to try to make matters better. Now, what happens in between the First Continental Congress of 1774 and then when the Second Continental Congress of 1775 meets? Well, events such as Lexington and Concord, where we have the first time that colonists and colonial militias are fighting openly, shooting, killing, bloodshed between the colonists and the British. So things escalate pretty significantly, to say the least. Lexington and Concord takes place in April of 1775. And that urges all 13 colonies eventually to send delegates, and they have people in their states pick who they thought were the best and brightest members of those states to go represent them to the State House in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1775 to figure things out. Just some quick facts about the Second Continental Congress. They met from May 10th, 1775, all the way up until 1781, the end of the war. And they did meet primarily at first in Philadelphia, but a couple of different locations because the war, they had to move around and were worried about the British capturing them. We'll get to that later. The primary president of the Second Continental Congress that we'll focus on is John Hancock of Massachusetts. There were 343 rotating delegates of the Second Continental Congress, so people weren't there the whole time from different states that kind of circulated, came in, came out. And so some interesting stuff there. Now, some of the heavy hitters that came and met at the Second Continental Congress, we're talking Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Sam Adams, Hall and Oates, Patrick Henry, John Hancock. I'm just kidding about the Hall and Oates thing. They weren't really there. They'll come much later and bring beautiful music to a sad, sad world. You're making my dreams come true. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. None of the kids watching this have any idea what the heck I'm talking about. Hall and Oates, they're fantastic. Look them up. Now, a common misconception, though, is that the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, started the Revolutionary War, and that's it. And it was the first time that there was actual, violent engagement between the two sides. But when they met at the Second Continental Congress, all of these delegates in 1775, they were not ready to become their own independent nation just yet. What were some of the first matters of business? Well, they did decide to create what was called the Continental Army, and that will become very important, obviously, out of militias gathered around Boston, Massachusetts. So they took those militias and created a Continental Army that they would supervise and try to help fund. And they also decided that they needed to appoint a general, a commanding general for this new Continental Army. And they looked at the delegation that was there in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they're looking around, and there was a Virginia planter who had experience in the French and Indian War named George Washington, who was in the crowd. And wouldn't you know it, listen to this move here. George Washington showed up to the Second Continental Congress wearing his military uniform. So imagine how funny that would have been just to be a fly on the wall watching the conversation when they were like, who should we appoint to be general of the Continental Army? And they're looking around the room and Washington's just sitting there in his military uniform like, I don't know. Yeah, who should we appoint, right? I mean, maybe me. Maybe me. So did he want to become the general of this new army? Yes, absolutely. They create the Continental Army. They appoint George Washington the head general. For a number of reasons, he had experience, but he was also a native of the colonies, and they thought that was important. He gets sent off to Boston, or around Boston in 1775. This is kind of right after the Battle of Bunker Hill, which I also talked about in other videos, and I'm not going to get into so much here. So that's where the war effort's going. But as far as breaking away from Britain, not quite yet. In July of 1775, the Second Continental Congress also created what was called the Olive Branch Petition. It was like a one last-ditch effort to try to reunite the colonies and Great Britain. And it was a letter signed basically to King George III of Great Britain, 38-year-old ruler, monarch of Great Britain at the time, basically asking him, please take away what we deem are these violations to our rights and these things that are causing us distress so that things can return to normal. And King George, when he gets the Olive Branch Petition, refuses to even read it because after Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, he says, quote, "The colonies are an open and unavowed rebellion, and they need to be stopped." And Great Britain and King George III are already organizing military operations and ways of crushing this rebellion. So he has no interest in the Olive Branch Petition. But it shows you that even after Lexington and Concord, the delegates at the Second Continental Congress were really not ready to declare themselves separate. What do they do the rest of the year in 1775 in Philadelphia? Well, this was the colony's de facto government kind of running the rebellion/war efforts, if you will. They decided to appoint ambassadors to go overseas and try to ask foreign countries for help. They raised the army. They tried to raise currency to fund the army, get munitions and supplies for the army, try to get European nations involved in the struggle on their side. Wink, wink, France, most specifically. And that's pretty much how they spent the rest of the year. And they still were not at the point yet by the end of 1775 where they really wanted to separate and become their own independent nation. At this point, they are still fighting for their rights as Englishmen, as a member of the British Empire. Things changed in 1776, and I'm not going to get into this too much, but in January of 1776, a pamphlet gets written called Common Sense by Thomas Paine, T-Paine, if you will. And basically the gist of Common Sense, and again, I'm not going to dive too into this. I actually might make a separate video in the future on it. He argues that separating from Great Britain as the colonies just makes common sense. They are an entire ocean away that takes 6 months to traverse. We don't have representation in British Parliament. We have all these issues going on here. It just makes common sense that these 13 colonies, now with millions of people totally separate of the empire, should just separate and form their own country. And it really does help swing the opinion of a lot of people in the not the United States, not yet. Spoiler alert, I got too far ahead of myself there. In the colonies that, maybe we should just separate. And that also helps sway a lot of the delegates. By the time you get to June of 1776, the Lee Resolution is picked up by the Second Continental Congress, where they decide that they should probably start writing and drafting a Declaration of Independence. Now, they did this for a couple of reasons. Yes, more people thought that breaking away from Great Britain made more sense in 1776. They saw that this relationship was not getting fixed or amended in any ways. But also they realized that with this ongoing fighting that was taking place, they really needed some foreign alliances to come and help them out. And they weren't going to do that as long as the colonies still recognized themselves as a part of Great Britain. If they said, hey, we're something totally different and we're fighting for freedom, that's going to be more of a reason for foreign countries to get involved to help them and to try to benefit from that. So the Declaration of Independence was also, hey, we want to start our own country and we don't think this works anymore, but we also want to inspire foreign countries to come help us out. Now, the Second Continental Congress put together a committee of 5 to write the Declaration of Independence. And yes, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia is the primary writer, but it was a committee of 5 that worked on it together over the course of 17 days between June and July of 1776 to create the Declaration of Independence. Who was on this committee, you ask? Robert Livingston of New Jersey. Shout outs, New Jersey, that's right. Roger Sherman of Connecticut. I'm the best delegate in the league. Don't come at me with a sorry receiver like Crabtree. Sorry, that's Richard Sherman. This is Roger Sherman of Connecticut. You also had Ben Franklin, who was probably the most famous and respected person in the country pre-United States of America, most respected person in the colonies. John Adams of Massachusetts, vicious patriot at this time, and made lots of arguments at the Second Continental Congress that they need to separate. And then Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who was considered a brilliant writer and really smart individual. And most people thought that John Adams was going to become the primary author of the Declaration of Independence because he had been so boisterous the whole time about separating. But John Adams makes the argument to the Committee of 5 that the author needs to be Thomas Jefferson for a couple of reasons. One, not a lot of people liked John Adams inside of the Continental Congress. He argued vehemently and often, and even resorted to attacking people sometimes, so he wasn't necessarily very liked, and he thought that his declaration would get turned down. He also realized that Thomas Jefferson's from Virginia. Now, why would that matter? Most of the events leading up to, the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War took place in and around Boston, Massachusetts, New England, where John Adams was from. If he writes the Declaration of Independence, it's going to look like a declaration of one colony versus the British Empire. If Jefferson from the South, from a different part of the colonies, writes it, now it's all of the colonies together against the British Empire. So a bit of a strategic play there too. Thomas Jefferson is going to be the main author. Now, where does Jefferson draw his ideas from as far as writing the Declaration of Independence? He looks up English philosopher John Locke, who felt that government had the right to give their people life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Jefferson's going to, manipulate that a little bit to fit what he believes should be, this new nation of the United States of America, which should be their philosophy. And he argues that government should exist to give us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Your life, your freedom, and that you should be able to do whatever makes you happy as long as it's like within the limits of the law. I don't think you can be like, stealing cars makes me happy. Is that okay? No, that's not okay. But so he sits down and he writes this wonderful, beautiful document, the Declaration of Independence. And it's basically got three parts that I'll talk about very quickly. I'm not going to go over the entire thing. But the preamble, the beginning, he states for anybody reading why the colonies are breaking away and becoming their own independent country. He says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Now note, at the time, that kind of only meant white men, and it kind of only meant white landowning men. This didn't include Native Americans, African Americans, or women of the time. That'll come later, right? But he sets the standards for what our nation is supposed to believe going forward, what we strive to try to be and represent, and some would argue we're still going to do that today. But we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator, God, with certain inalienable rights that can't be taken away, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson goes on to say that any time a government isn't helping you secure these rights, in fact, if they're taking those rights away, you have the right to overthrow that government. And that's what he says Great Britain is doing to the colonies. They're taking away life, they're taking away liberty, they're taking away our pursuit of happiness. And he says they only get their power to control us from our consent. We allow them to control us and to govern us. And if we no longer agree to that, then we can overthrow them. Beautiful, majestic words that would inspire revolutions around the globe after it was written. He then goes on to list all of the crimes that he believes King George has committed against the colonies, which is like, whew, very spicy for the times. And at the very end, the last part of the Declaration of Independence, they announce themselves as the United States of America, and they basically tell Great Britain that they're going to fight for this to the death. Some of my favorite quotes from the Declaration. He says, "In order to secure this new nation, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So we will die for this cause, we'll spend all of our money for this cause, and we'll give all of our honor towards this cause." Absolutely amazing, powerful words written in the Declaration of Independence there. They're going to literally die, fight to the death for this. They introduced the Declaration of Independence July 2nd, 1776. It gets edited for a couple of days. Some of the main parts taken out are things that Jefferson says about slavery being not correct or wrong. Those get chopped to kind of make Southern colonies feel more at ease with accepting it. Then the Declaration of Independence is accepted July 4th, 1776, which is why we celebrate our Independence Day on July 4th. That's the reason why, 4th of July. We celebrate the acceptance and, the acceptance of the Declaration of Independence, as well as Will Smith fighting off alien invaders and protecting us. No, I'm just kidding. That hasn't actually happened yet. It's coming. The Declaration of Independence itself wasn't actually signed until August 2nd, 1776. Not a lot of people know that. And one point that I want to make to finish up the video here is you have to understand the moment, the significance of signing that Declaration of Independence and sending it to King George III. Those delegates, 56 of them that signed the Declaration of Independence, announcing their freedom, were committing treason, which most places view treason, betraying your country, as a very serious crime punishable by death. All of them were essentially signing their death warrants. Nobody at that time in August of 1776 thought that the United States of America, the 13 colonies, were going to be able to actually win their independence. They all assumed that Great Britain would win, would put down this rebellion, and that they were, dead men walking. So hats off to those delegates, the bravery that they showed to basically sign your death warrant and sign your life away for this cause. Now, and last thing that I'll say, and I always say this to my classes, people say that Lexington and Concord were the first shots at the revolution. Yeah, there was fighting there. I would argue the Declaration of Independence is the first shot of the revolution. That is the first sign that the United States sends a shudder across the world. We're something different. We're no longer fighting for our rights as Englishmen or as a part of the British Empire. We're fighting for our rights as members of the United States of America. So there you have it. That's the quick story behind the Second Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the Congress goes on throughout the war deciding things. Now that the Declaration has been announced and written, they need to win their independence, and we'll see how that turns out. Thank you guys for watching the video. And to quote George Washington, the surest basis for public happiness is knowledge. So go out there and get some. Hey, thanks so much for watching in case you missed it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, or subscribe down below. Any of that would be just fine. Thank you so much for your appreciation of history, and I hope you come back and check out another video.